Hi, welcome to week 2 of Special Education 501 This week, the topic is a little bit dry because we'll be talking about the laws that relate to evaluation in special education, particularly for the purposes of determining whether or not a child is eligible for special education services. So while it's a dry topic, it's a really important one because this is the process through which children get assessed and perhaps get entry into special education. So you as a therapist or a teacher really serve as an advocate for the child in this very important process. As an advocate, you may help the parents negotiate the IEP meeting and determine whether the assessments that have been conducted are appropriate for their child. And as an advocate, you may help the school district determine whether or not they've followed the procedures for assessment correctly. So with that in mind, we're going to be talking about the very specific process that the law has put together to make sure that the evaluations that determine eligibility are appropriate and correct. So evaluation, according to IDEA in 2004, this is what the regulations will look like, and this is what we'll be taking a look at through the course of this lecture. First of all, we'll be looking at the purposes of evaluation. Why do we do it? We'll be looking at how do you request an evaluation and who can be the one that requests that evaluation. We're going to look at the very important topic of parent consent and how we obtain that and what happens if we can't. We'll be talking about the whole process of initial evaluation and what goes into it. Also, we'll be talking about IDEA's definition of a child with a disability because that's very different from what we tend to think about when we think about disability in general. So you'll be seeing that you may have a disability, but you may not fit the definition of IDEA's notion of what it is to be a child with a disability. We'll be looking at how eligibility is determined. And finally, we'll take a look at the reevaluation process, which takes place for children every 3 years. So let's talk first about the purposes of initial evaluation. First of all, when a child comes into the special education process, we're looking at whether or not they have a disability as defined by IDEA. So that's our primary purpose. And in order to determine that, we're going to gather information that will help us determine not only if they have a disability, but also what their educational needs are. If you remember from last week, I said that it's really important to have purpose when we talk about assessment. And so in this case, the purpose is to help us determine what the child's educational needs are, and then also to guide decision making about appropriate educational programs for the child. So when we start the initial evaluation, we're looking at eligibility, we're looking at educational needs, and we're also thinking about, well, where is this child's needs best going to be served? How do you request an initial evaluation? Well, anyone can request an initial evaluation. Most often it's a parent or a public agency who requests that initial evaluation. Well, parents pretty easy to explain, I guess, because typically we understand what a parent is, but we'll also talk a little bit about the fact that not all children live with their parents. Some children live in foster care, some children live in the custody of the state, so we'll talk a little bit about that. What's a public agency? Well, public agency, for the most part, we're talking about schools. So the local educational agency, for most children, is considered the public agency who can ask for an initial evaluation. And as a teacher, you serve as a part of that public agency. So a teacher can request an initial evaluation of a child as well within that public agency. Outside people can refer, and you will see for children who are transitioning as 3-year-olds into the public school system, the public agency in California might be the regional center that asks for an initial evaluation of a child. And we can sometimes see doctors or other people who may have contact with the child encouraging the parent to ask for an initial evaluation. Now, something that's really important to keep in mind for parents is that if the parent is requesting an initial evaluation, they must do so in writing, and that serves a couple of different purposes. One is, if you put something in writing, there's a date on it. And even an email is dated, and you can look later on to see that the agency did receive and open that email. And a letter, of course, is also a dated correspondence. That date's important because it triggers timelines that we'll be talking about that ensure that the evaluation happens in a timely manner. In order to go forward with an initial evaluation, the public agency, remember that's a school, must obtain parental consent before conducting an initial evaluation of the child. So even if the parent asks for an evaluation, that doesn't mean that it can go forward without them providing consent, and consent's very important. So before any initial evaluation that's been requested, the public agency must provide the parent with what is called prior written notice. So there's a couple of things in that are important to think about. What is prior, for example? Well, prior means that it happens before any evaluation can take place. So the parent gets a notice, or a written notice, if you'll notice that word, that says we will be or we would like to conduct an evaluation of your child for potential eligibility for special education. It will say on that notice what some of the areas that will be assessed are, and it will also say what kinds of people will be conducting the assessment. For example, school psychologist or speech therapist or classroom teacher. A lot of people might be involved, and they would be indicated on that written notice. Along with that written notice, the parent also receives, and this is usually for the very first time, because remember, this is an initial evaluation, the parent receives their procedural safeguards notice. Now, what does that mean? Once you enter into the special education process, you have what is called due process rights. And those due process rights entitle you to challenge anything that has been determined by the school district, to challenge decisions that the school district makes. And so it's very important to know what those procedural safeguards are and to understand them. We have gotten a lot better over the years with making those procedural safeguard notices understandable for parents, but as an advocate for parents, it's very important that you understand what those notices are all about. So you need to read them, and read them carefully, and be able to interpret them to parents. So along with written notice about the assessment, parents will be getting a procedural safeguard notice. And along with that written notice is usually a form that will ask parents to provide their what is called informed written consent. So you're informed because you got notice. You have an idea about what kinds of assessments will be done and what kinds of people will be doing them. And you put your signature on a piece of paper that says, I consent for you to go ahead and conduct this evaluation. So the parent consents or not. And I guess an important question is, what happens if the parent doesn't consent? And we'll be talking about that in a moment. So keep this in mind. This is very important as an advocate. Consent is for the initial evaluation and nothing more. When a parent signs their name or caregiver signs their name to that consent form, they are only saying you can go ahead and conduct an evaluation. They're not saying you can go ahead and put my child in special education. They're not saying you can go ahead and provide any treatments that you want to provide. They're just saying you can go ahead and conduct this evaluation. That's all. So keep that in mind. It's really important. Parents often get worried that if they say yes to an evaluation, they're saying yes to special education, and that's not the case. So it's not construed as a consent for initial provision of any kind of service to the child that has to do with special education. Now let's talk about what happens if parents don't consent. Now, obviously, if the parent has or caregiver has requested an evaluation, they're going to be signing their consent so that that can go ahead and be done. But what is the public agency's obligation if the parent does not provide consent for the initial evaluation, or if they don't respond to a request to provide that consent? Well, several things. First of all, if the parent does not provide consent, if they send back the form and it says, no, I do not give you my consent to do this initial evaluation, two things can happen. Most often what happens is that we drop it. Schools will just say, okay, they don't want the evaluation. We won't go ahead and do it, and that stops the process. And obviously, when the process stops, the child is not going to get special education. But sometimes children exhibit such a great level of need. Very often it's in the emotional or behavioral area. But they exhibit such a great area of need that the school or the public agency feels compelled to do that evaluation in order to provide special education services to the child. So in that case, the school may seek its own due process rights because schools or public agencies have those rights as well in special education. And they can seek to take over the rights of the parent in terms of the educational process. And in doing so, perhaps get a surrogate appointed to oversee the special education services for the child, or some other legal process so that they can go ahead and get permission for the initial evaluation. That happens very rarely, but it can happen. And if the parent doesn't respond to the request, in other words, we send the written notice home and ask for written consent, and they don't send the form back, if that happens, the public agency has an obligation to try to get the parent to respond. And a good rule of thumb is at least 3 documented attempts that an attempt has been made to get the parent to respond to the consent. So often schools will send registered letters. They'll make documented phone calls. They may send someone to the home to try to get the consent, but they have to document that they've made a good faith effort to get the consent. And if, again, there is no consent, the school district or the public agency cannot proceed with the evaluation. Let's go back to that for one moment before we move on, because I said earlier that a parent or a public agency or a teacher or a therapist could request an evaluation. In a therapist case, I would think going through the parent would be the smart thing to do, but let's say a teacher or a parent makes that request. And the school, in looking at the available information about the child, determines that perhaps it's not needed. Perhaps special education really isn't in the card because either enough things haven't been done to try to accommodate the child in general education, or the child's issues don't seem to be severe enough to warrant a special education evaluation. The school, the public agency, I'm going to use the word school because it's easier, can say no to the parent. They can, and as long as they give a written notice to the parent, listing their reasons for denying that evaluation. And of course, remember, the parent has due process rights, so they can always go back and ask the school or take it through the due process procedures in order to try to get that evaluation done anyway, even if the school says no. So let's assume that the parent has consented to the evaluation and the school has determined that that evaluation is an appropriate thing to try to do. And so what happens next? Well, first of all, the law says that that evaluation has to be conducted within 60 days of parental consent for evaluation. So you have 60 calendar days, not working days, 60 calendar days to get the assessment done and to hold an IEP for the child. So the IEP has to be conducted within those 60 days. That's really important. And that's one of the things that schools really try hard to adhere to because that's an easy thing for the federal government to evaluate. Did you adhere to the 60-day timeline? I'll tell you a little story. My oldest stepson was going through the process of evaluation for special education services. He had learning disabilities, and he was coming from outside the school district, so he was new to them. And they conducted their evaluation, and I got a notice in the mail within the 60-day timeline that they were completing their evaluation and they wanted to conduct an IEP, and they gave me a date for the IEP. Well, that date was not a convenient date for me, and the time was not a convenient time for me. And so I called them and I said, I cannot make that date, but I certainly want to be at my child's IEP meeting, so let's change the date to a time that's convenient for me. And their response was, well, we can't change the date because if we go beyond it, we've gone beyond the 60 days. So that's how serious that 60 days is as far as the school is concerned. Well, with my written permission, they did extend it a few days more so that I could participate in the IEP. But that is not something that they like to do. They really do try to stay within that 60-day time frame. And just as an aside, summers don't count. So let's say if you started an evaluation process at the end or in the middle of May, for example, your 60 days wouldn't be up when the school year ended, and the summer wouldn't count for those 60 days. But when you came back for the next school year, when the student came back for the next school year, the 60 days would pick up where it left off. The evaluation, the law says, must be full and individual. We're going to think about those terms a little. What does full mean? Full means that it's a comprehensive evaluation. Individual means that it's looking solely at materials that relate to that individual child. And for a complete evaluation, a full evaluation, we have to use a variety of assessment tools and strategies. So that's a really important point. Under the law, no child can be determined to be eligible for special education on the basis of one test or one strategy. I think we've mentioned last week that sometimes one of the mistakes that is made is that we make decisions based on either inappropriate tests or opinion or one test. And under the law, if we're making a decision about placing a child in special education, that can't be done. We have to use a variety of tools and strategies within that timeline. And we must gather relevant information about the child. What does relevant mean? Relevant means that we're looking at things that pertain to the educational process. So we're looking at the functional skills that the child has, and those include both self-help skills and how the child applies their academic knowledge in real-world situations. So what do they look like in the real world? So we look at that. We look at their developmental history. So what are factors that may have contributed or that may be flags that suggest that there could be a disability? And we look at academic information. And of course, in terms of educational needs, academic information is often the most important information. And that includes not only what schools are able to gather about a child, but also what the parent can provide. The parents are very important in this process, and their opinions and their ideas, their knowledge about the child needs to be respected. So again, part of the initial evaluation would normally include an IEP team and other qualified professionals looking at what already exists about a child. I just want to, before we move on, emphasize the fact that it's a team. And not only must we use multiple tools and strategies, but no one person can make the determination that a child is eligible for special education. So we're looking at a whole team of people that is going to be looking at the child, first looking at existing evaluation data, and then perhaps looking at other data that needs to be gathered. And by the way, that team includes the parent under the law. So what they look at initially might be information and evaluations that are provided by parents. So the parent may have gotten an outside evaluation, for example, from a therapist or a doctor or someone else who has knowledge about the child. The parent has their own information about how the child functions, both functionally in the real world and in terms of how they approach their academic needs. And then current assessments, so both classroom-based assessments, those would be things that a teacher typically does, local assessments, so what the school does, and then state assessments. So those high-stakes tests that we talked about last week are important in this evaluation process. They also look at classroom-based observations. That's a real key to this whole process, and then observations by teachers and related service providers. So the classroom's teachers are very often involved in this process. If you look at these things, particularly current assessments, classroom-based observations, and observations by teachers and related service providers, you should be thinking that that looks familiar to you, even if you haven't been involved in special education. If you've been in schools, this looks like the student study team process, because before a child moves on in the special education evaluation process, all existing data must be looked at. And we try to make changes within the classroom or within the child's program in the general ed setting before we even think about moving towards special education. So all those things are really important information that that we look at before moving on to do more testing. And so on the basis of that review, the IEP team determines what additional data, if any, is needed to determine if the child is a child with a disability. So remember the purposes, what the child's educational needs are, the child's present levels of academic achievement and related developmental needs, and whether the child needs special education and related services. So that's what we're looking at. Do we need to get additional data to make these determinations? And also whether any additions or modifications to the special education and related services are needed to enable the child to meet the annual goals in the IEP and to participate in the general education curriculum as appropriate. Because we really don't want to remove children from the classroom, from the general ed classroom, unless we need to. Because as much as I like special education, I've been in it all my life, we don't want to put children in special education if we can keep them in general ed. And even if we need to give them special education services, we want to still give them as much of their program as possible in the general education curriculum. Because simply stated, general ed and special ed are two different things. General ed gives a child exposure to everything that we expect a child to learn on an ongoing basis throughout the process of schooling. But special education targets specific skills and specific needs of the child that certainly are related to what the general ed curriculum is all about, but may look different or may be delivered at a different pace than how it's delivered in general education. So in that regard, we're removing the child from opportunity that his typical peers might have. So we make those decisions carefully. So we want to know, is the child eligible? What kind of needs does a child have? What kind of program would be best for the child? And then what kind of modifications do we need so that the child can progress and meet goals? And all those things, a group can do that review without a meeting. So there is going to be a meeting in the end, but each member of the group may conduct their own review of existing data without meeting together to discuss it. Ultimately, they come together at the IEP, but they don't need to do this process together as a team. They can do it individually. So the question is, do we have enough data based on what already exists to provide that information that we need to make those determinations that I just talked about? If the answer is no, we don't have enough data to determine whether the child's eligible and what his program needs to be, then we need to administer other assessments. We need to administer tests and other measures to produce the data that we need to make those decisions. And most often, although we can make those decisions based on existing data, I would say most often schools will look at the existing data, the team will look at that, and then say, well, this is all good, but we still need to do further testing. If there is enough data, the public agency must notify the parent of that determination, that we've looked at what exists and we're ready to go ahead with an IEP meeting. We've made our determination, and here are the reasons for it. Here's the reasons why we feel we don't need to do any further testing. Usually that occurs when the team has reviewed the data and thought, you know what, we don't need to really do testing because the data suggests that this is not a child with special needs. So it's very important that the reason be given to the parent, because the parents have the right to then turn around and say, well, that's all well and good, but I still want you to do an assessment of my child. Again, remember, they have due process rights, and those rights are very important. So here's this group. The group of qualified professionals, along with the parent, determines whether the child is a child with a disability under IDEA. That's what, I don't know, is that what your IEP team looks like? The picture is there to just remind you that it is a whole group of people that make that determination with all their reports. So what does this group do? They determine whether the child is a child with a disability, and there are a couple of factors involved in making this determination. One is, how does IDEA define a child with a disability? So if you remember, I said it's not necessarily the same as how we might define disability. It's not necessarily the same as how other laws might define disability. IDEA is very specific about who a child with a disability is, and we're going to talk about that. They have a special rule for eligibility determination. That's going to be something really important for you to keep in mind. And again, it involves a variety of information sources, so assessments and gathering information from other people involved with the child, all the things that we've talked about already. What is IDEA's special rule? Well, a child cannot be a child with a disability. So this is where we start. If the determinant factor for deciding so is lack of appropriate instruction in reading, lack of appropriate instruction in math, or limited English proficiency, and the child does not otherwise meet the eligibility criteria. So let's talk about what does that mean if the determinant factor for deciding so is. You may have a child in your classroom or with whom you work who is struggling in school, maybe struggling, let's take reading as an example. So maybe struggling with reading, definitely not keeping up with his peers, behind in the process, maybe even a year or so behind or more, really having trouble. And the IEP team takes a look at that child. Clearly they need something, and they look at what has the child experience of appropriate instruction been so far? And what does appropriate instruction mean? Well, schools are under the law, particularly No Child Left Behind and the current replacements for that. Under the law, we are required to provide evidence-based instruction in both reading and math, and to document the fidelity of that. In other words, to document that we have selected evidence-based materials and that we have implemented an evidence-based program consistently, and that suggests that we provided appropriate instruction. Well, if that doesn't exist, for some reason, a common reason, for example, might be that a child misses a lot of school. Or it may be that a school, on a larger scale reason, the school may not have implemented an appropriate instructional program. If the child has not had appropriate instruction, there are other reasons that they are behind. Perhaps they just moved to this country, for example, and they haven't had instruction in this country in reading that we can say is appropriate. Well, that child needs help, definitely, but that's not a special education or a disability kind of reason for the help. We need to find other sources to provide them the help that they need to catch up in reading. And the same would be true for math. And the issue of limited English proficiency suggests that just because you don't speak English, and that certainly may interfere with your ability to keep up with your peers in reading and or math, that's not sufficient reason for you to be eligible for special education. Now, it doesn't mean that a child who's limited English proficient cannot be eligible for special ed. You have to also have other eligibilities, which is a very hard thing to determine, and we're going to be talking about that more next week. Why it's so difficult to determine whether you have a disability if you're limited English proficient, but that can't be the reason alone that you would be eligible for special education. And then the other factor is you need to meet eligibility criteria, which we're going to be talking about in a minute. So you have to have appropriate instruction in reading, appropriate instruction in math, and you can't just be limited English proficient. There are other ways to provide you services if you're one of those three. I'm going to pause here for a second because my slide is stuck, and then we'll go on from there. Okay, we're back. I've figured out how to get the slide to move again. Sorry about that. So determining eligibility. We're looking at a variety of sources, remember. So here's just a slide that shows you some of the things that we take a look at. Obviously, aptitude tests. That is, do you have the innate ability to do well in school? Aptitude tests help us to determine the difference between learning disabilities and intellectual disabilities. Achievement tests tell us a little bit about how you are performing in school. Parent input, teacher recommendations, and also information about the child's physical condition, social or cultural background, and adaptive behavior. I'm going to talk a little bit about those three. Physical condition. Why is that important to determine whether a child is eligible for special education? Well, think of the things that could interfere with your ability to progress in school. Poor vision, poor hearing, those are examples of physical conditions that can impact your progress. So we want to take a look at that. And we also want to take a look, remember, developmentally at how you've progressed through the various developmental stages physically. Just to get a sense of whether there's an intact physical system. And then social and cultural background gives us some information about why you may not be doing well in school, or more importantly, what might be best approaches to helping you do well in school. So taking into account your culture, your experiences, and how can we best adapt the school to meet that background needs. And then adaptive behavior. Why is adaptive behavior important? Well, we look at aptitude. In other words, do you have the ability to succeed in school intellectually? And then we also look at adaptive behavior. How do you function outside of school, which is also an indicator of your intellectual ability. Some people don't do well on aptitude tests, for example, but they demonstrate skills outside of school that suggest that they do have ability. There's a researcher at UC Riverside, Jane Mercer, who coined a term back in the 70s, the 6-hour retardate. Now those children were children who were considered to be, at that time they used the word retarded, we don't use that word anymore, but they were considered to be retarded in school, so they were in special classes for what at that time was called the educable mentally retarded. But they weren't seen as having any impairment outside of school. They functioned well in their community. They were considered to be, if you will, normal or typical. And she asked the question, well, what's the difference? And the difference is tests often, even aptitude tests, which are supposed to look at innate ability, are very much based on what you learn in school. And adaptive behavior is, if you want to think about adaptive behavior in a way, it's like street smarts. Adaptive behavior reflects your capabilities of functioning in the real world. So we look at that as well. And we have to make sure that all the information that we get from all of these sources is documented and carefully considered by that team. So IDEA contains additional procedures for identifying children with specific learning disabilities. There's a component on the IDEA page that I sent you to try to find out more information about the law. There's a component there if you want to look at identifying specific learning disabilities. There's a whole section on that. You can look at that in more depth. I'm just going to mention it briefly here because we're going to be talking about it in another class session later on. But the procedures that are now in IDEA, so in 2004, this was the first time those procedures were in place. The procedures now are something called response to intervention, or RTI, probably something you've heard a lot about. RTI is a way of identifying children with specific learning disabilities that differs from the old way. The old way was very much test-based. So we tested your aptitude, your innate ability, if you will, your intellectual ability, and we also tested your achievement, and we looked for a discrepancy between the two. And the discrepancy we were looking for was that we expected your intellectual ability to be higher than your academic achievement in order to label you specific as a child with specific learning disabilities. So how big a discrepancy? We were looking in California, we looked for a 1.5 standard deviation difference between some measures of aptitude and some measures of achievement. And that might not mean a whole lot to you right now, but remember the term standard deviation because we'll be talking about that in a couple of classes from now. And I'll come back to how we used to identify children with specific learning disabilities and how we still do very often. But now states have the opportunity to look at a different way of identifying children with specific learning disabilities that doesn't involve that discrepancy, but involves whether or not you respond to intervention when it's provided to you. And that intervention is typically provided within the context of general education. And the idea behind it is that in a typical gen ed classroom, most children will succeed if we provide them with appropriate instruction. Remember those terms in reading and math. So evidence-based instruction, good teachers, good teaching, most children will succeed. But some children, even given that good learning environment, won't succeed for a number of different reasons. Some because they maybe didn't have the background experiences that they needed in order to understand what's happening in the classroom. Maybe they didn't go to preschool. Some children won't succeed because they come in with a language other than English, and so they're catching up in language with their peers. There's a variety of reasons. So those children that stand out, that start to fall behind under this new system, would be given intervention within the context of the general ed classroom. And so maybe more intensive instruction, maybe more time with instruction and reading, for example, maybe some tutoring after school, something like that, that would be in addition to what's already provided in the classroom. And the idea is then that most of those children with that kind of help will begin to catch up with their peers, so they don't have a disability. But within that small group of children who needed extra help, there will still be some children who don't succeed despite that intervention, who need even more intensive kinds of intervention services. Now, we can either continue to provide, we can intensify the intervention that we're giving within the general ed classroom without calling them learning disabled yet, or we can begin to look at them through the special ed referral process to see if they indeed do have a disability. But if they continue, even with more intensive intervention within general ed, to fall behind, those are children that we call, that we say they've not responded to intervention. They haven't responded to an RTI model, and those then are the children that we can think about as being children with a specific learning disability. So that's a new way of thinking about that. And we're going to do a whole day on response to intervention and the assessment process that goes along with that. So how do IDEA and the regulations define who a child with a disability is? I'm sure you're wondering about that. Well, here's a slide that you don't want to typically see. These are the actual regulations in the law that talk about what a child with a disability is. And so you have access to that on the IDEA link that I gave you. So if you want to read through this material, you certainly can. But let's make it a little bit simpler. Who is a child with a disability? A child with a disability means that it's a child that's been evaluated in accordance with the law as having either autism, so I'm going to go through this list, but you have it on the PowerPoint, so I'm going to go through it rather quickly. Autism, deaf-blindness, deafness, these are the categories for special education. Emotional disturbance, hearing impairment, mental retardation, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, other health impairment, specific learning disability, speech or language impairment, traumatic brain injury, which is a new category under the law, or visual impairment, including blindness. So there they all are again. And, now this is really important, and who, by reason thereof, needs special education and related services. By reason thereof. So let me put it into perspective. You can, for example, be deaf. That's certainly, we would consider that a disability. You can be deaf but not require special education or related services. So in other words, if you do okay in general education, despite your impairment, you could be blind, for example, and be able to function in a general education classroom. If you don't need special education, you are not a child with a disability. I had a friend, for example, who's a paraplegic. There's nothing wrong with her brain. There's nothing wrong with her ability to learn. She just is mobile in a wheelchair, not on her legs. So she doesn't need special education, or she didn't need it as a child to succeed in school. She just needed access to the classroom. So that's not special education. That by reason thereof is the most important term you can think about. So there have to be educational reasons that a child is considered a child with a disability. There was a court case a while back, I think it was in the 80s actually, that was brought on behalf of a child who was deaf and who was in a general education classroom. She did not have special education services, and she didn't have an interpreter, she didn't have any special assistance. She pretty much got by on the basis of lip reading, which, if you know anything about lip reading, is not a very successful way to get information. The teacher turns her head, you don't see the lips, you don't get the information. And even if you can read the lips, there's about 25% accuracy rate in terms of deciphering the information that comes across that way. But this child was in a general ed classroom without any assistance of that kind anyway, just getting by on what she could get through lip reading and other forms, reading the text, for example. So her parents brought suit because the school refused to give her special education services. They wouldn't give her an interpreter. And the parents wanted that, so they brought suit. They went through their due process rights, and it went all the way through the Supreme Court. And the court determined, oddly enough, that this child wasn't eligible for special education, that she was not a child with a disability under the law. And the reason was that the court said she does not need special education services because she's doing okay in school. So okay, what's a free, appropriate public education? It means good enough, according to the courts. Good enough for her was that she could get by. She was getting, let's say B's and C's. She was getting enough information to be successful in school. But she also tested to be gifted. And her parents' argument was that she would be doing much better than okay if she had access to an interpreter. And the court said, well, okay is good enough. And she and the parents, the family lost that case. So she did not need special education services, even though she had what we would consider a disability, because by reason thereof. This slide just shows you a little bit about the relationship between the federal law, which is IDEA 2004, and states. So states have, of course, their own interpretations of the law. And when they get money from the federal government, what happens is the federal government makes regulations. So that's what we're kind of covering right now, is what are the regulations around IDEA. So the federal government makes the regulations, and then the states are allowed to interpret those regulations their own way. They cannot be any less stringent than what the federal law is, but they can be more stringent. So for example, remember that 60-day timeline? A state could decide, as they interpret the law, that they want to make a 50-day timeline. And that's okay, because that is more stringent than the federal government is saying you need to do. A state could not, on the other hand, decide to do a 70-day timeline, because that is less stringent. So the federal government makes the regs, then the states take those and they write their own regulations under the auspices of the federal ones. So it's a partnership. Just very briefly, I'm going to talk about what happens for young children, so children ages 3 through 9. Most states don't go all the way to 9, but under federal law, children ages 3 through 9 can also be considered to be a child with a disability if they have developmental delays. So in California, many districts have decided that children who are preschool age, so ages 3 through preschool or 3 up until kindergarten, can be labeled developmentally delayed and get special education services. So they're not labeled with one of those disabilities on that list that I just showed you. They're labeled developmental delayed. So why is that? The idea is that we can't really tell with very young children what kind of a disability they actually have. So for example, you can't be learning disabled if you're a 3-year-old because you haven't been in school yet and you haven't been asked to learn to read. Until you're asked to learn to read, you can't have a reading-related learning disability. But you could be showing some other kinds of developmental delays, perhaps a delay in language, perhaps a delay in cognition, or some other aspect of development. So we use that label to say, we can see you have a problem, and because you're falling behind developmentally, we can see you need some help, but we don't want to put a specific label on you yet because you're not old enough. So in many districts in California, the label from that list that I showed you, the label gets put on when you get to kindergarten, when you turn kindergarten age. But up until then, you may only be considered developmentally delayed. What is a developmental delay? This is one of those things that's defined by the state. How does the state define it? And it's measured by delays in one or more of these areas: physical development, cognitive development, communication development, social or emotional development, or adaptive development. So these are the kinds of things that we look at in very young children. We don't look at academics, obviously. We look at whether or not they're behind their peers. And in California, 50% delay in one of these areas would make you eligible for that label developmental delay, or a 33% delay in 2 or more areas of development would make you eligible for that label. And again, remember, by reason thereof. So you have to show that you need special education services. The vast majority of preschoolers who get special education services are children who have communication delays. That's probably the most typical diagnosis. Some of them will go on to be labeled as children with learning disabilities. Some of them will go on to be labeled as children with autism. Some of them may be labeled as children with cognitive impairments, but we might not know until we've had an opportunity to work with them over a couple of years in special education preschool programs. So is the child a child with a disability under IDEA? Well, we do an evaluation. And again, remember, it's multiple evaluations, multiple materials, multiple people doing it. A lot of thought goes into the process, and a team now comes together. The team, including the parents, comes together to review that information and to determine eligibility. So we get to an IEP. And at an IEP, a parent has a copy of the evaluation report given to them. So the reports from all of the professionals are given to them. And documentation of eligibility determination. That's a box on the IEP that gets checked off. Is this child eligible? And if so, what is their eligibility? So one of those labels that we talked about, or the label developmental delay. And that is at no cost to the parent. So this whole evaluation process does not cost the parent anything, which is a good thing, because an outside evaluation is thousands of dollars, not something that you want to have to spend money on. So I'm going to stop here for a second. We've gone all the way up to the evaluation process, and we're ready to look at reevaluations, which I'm going to do very quickly, so we're almost done with this lecture. But I want to just say a few things about the IEP before we move on. I'll go back to that slide. We talked about the parent receiving a copy of the evaluation report. That needs to be in a language that the parent can understand. And that's often a barrier for the schools, because our parents speak many different languages. Our caregivers speak many different languages. So they have to get a copy of that evaluation report in a language that they understand. If that's not available at the IEP meeting, there has to be an interpreter available to explain what that report says to the parent. And at some point after the IEP, the parent needs to get a copy of that report in a language that they understand. And the documentation of eligibility determination is all of those, the results of all of those tests and all of those observations and all of those reviews of everything about the child. So that's all documented in the child's folder at the IEP meeting. And at the IEP meeting, the parent has the opportunity to do several things. Number one, they can agree or disagree with the results of that evaluation. So let's say the evaluation takes place and the IEP team determines that this is a child with the eligibility of cognitive impairment. The law still shows it as mental retardation. That's not a term we use so much anymore, but cognitive impairment or intellectual impairment would be a more politically correct term, I guess. So let's say that that's the determination at the IEP meeting, and the parent disagrees. They feel that their child is not intellectually impaired, but in fact has a learning disability. They can, on the IEP, refuse to sign that part of the document. They can disagree with the evaluation report or the eligibility determination. And that can stop the whole process right there. They can disagree with that eligibility determination, but agree that the child needs special education services, and they can agree with the services that are being offered, and they can agree with the related services that are being offered, like speech therapy or physical therapy or something else. So those services might go ahead, but the eligibility determination may need to be reviewed in the meantime based on the parent request for due process on that particular item. I'm focusing on that item in particular because that's a really important one. I had mentioned how much an evaluation can cost. If the parent disagrees with the evaluation report, they have the right, of course they had that right anyway, but they have the right to go out and seek an outside evaluation. And many parents will do that, or some parents will do that. Parents who have the money, let's put it that way, because it is costly, will go out to seek an outside evaluation. And if that evaluation report disagrees with the school's evaluation, of course, this will be part of the due process procedures. The due process mediators will look at the two reports, the school's report and the outside evaluation. And if they determine that the outside evaluation is the better evaluation, and is the correct determination of eligibility, then that outside evaluation will need to be paid for by the school. But if the evaluation reports are the same between the school and the outside evaluator, or if the mediation process agrees with the school and not the parent will have to pay for the evaluation themselves. So taking the step of disagreeing with the evaluation report is a very important step for parents to take, because it can be costly for them, or it may result in them getting the correct determination of eligibility, because schools make mistakes, evaluators make mistakes, and we talked about those mistakes last week. So I'm going to finish up now with reevaluations, and that's going to be very quick, so give me another couple of minutes and we'll be done with this week. So reevaluations may occur not more than once a year, unless parent and the public agency agree otherwise. So it can happen more than once a year, but typically you would not reevaluate more than once a year. And there's a lot of reasons for that, not the least of which is that the assessment tools that we use, particularly standardized tests, are only designed to be used once a year. So that means that if we're going to do it more than once a year, if we're going to do a whole evaluation more than once a year, we're going to have to choose different tools, different assessment materials. So, but if the parent and public agency agree otherwise, we can reopen. In other words, we're talking about reopening an IEP and going through that whole evaluation process again. And that can happen. Perhaps the scenario might be, for example, that a child has been determined to have autism and is placed in a school or in a classroom for children with autism. And after a month or 3 in that classroom, the teacher and the parent begin to see that that's not the appropriate placement for the child, and that may not be the appropriate eligibility for the child. We see it very often in the early years, in preschool and in kindergarten, first or second grade, a child coming in with that label who just needed school. Maybe they're not talking, maybe they're not interacting socially when they come into special education, but it's because of their background experiences or their lack thereof. And once they are comfortable in a school setting, they begin to blossom, they start talking, they start interacting socially, and that eligibility just doesn't look correct anymore. So at that time, we might open up the IEP, open up the evaluation process, all those timelines and everything, and try to look for a new eligibility. So that may happen, but it's not likely to happen. And a reevaluation must occur at least once every 3 years. Those are the triennials that you might hear talked about. So triennial means that 3-year evaluation means that we do everything that we did in the initial evaluation, all the reviews of materials, all of the assessments and so forth. We do a complete reevaluation to determine whether the child is still eligible for special education. And in between those 3 years, we obviously have IEPs, but the assessments that we do, the evaluation process is less tedious, if you will. And it may be based on teacher report, classroom assessments, and things like that. The yearly IEPs are not as complete in terms of evaluation as the triennials are. because triennials are again looking at whether the child continues to be eligible for special ed or not. Now, you don't have to have a triennial. You can just have a regular IEP in 3 years if the parent and the public agency agree that a reevaluation is unnecessary. So, for example, you may have been, we'll go back to that label of autism, you may have been determined to be eligible on the basis of autism with accompanying educational needs, and it looks the same 3 years later. We don't need to go and do a whole reevaluation if the parent and the public agency, the school, agrees that it's not necessary. Otherwise, a reevaluation has everything in it that the initial evaluation has. That's why I said I can go through this quickly. All of those things that we've already talked about are part of the reevaluation. So parents get written notice, they get the procedural safeguards again, they get, we review existing data, we get parent consent, we get additional data if we need to, we involve the parent in the evaluation and eligibility determination. The same factors are in place and the same reports and so forth are given to parents. So it's the same as the initial evaluation. Evaluation is required before determining a child is no longer, so we want to get, let's say we want to exit the child from the program. We have to do a complete evaluation unless the child's eligibility under Part B ends. And that happens either when a child graduates from secondary school with a regular diploma or the child exceeds age eligibility for special education under state law. So age eligibility, children with who don't graduate from high school with a regular diploma, who have an IEP, are eligible to stay in school until they turn 22. So that while they're in school with an IEP, we still follow the evaluation procedures, the triennials, and so forth. When they age out or when they graduate, we do not need to do an evaluation in order for them to exit special education. Otherwise, if we want them to exit special education, let's say you're 12 and you've outgrown your need for special education services, we need to do a reevaluation to determine that you really don't need it anymore. But when you age out or when you graduate or age out with a summary of your academic performance and functional performance, including recommendations on how to meet your post-secondary goals. So when you leave special education because you've graduated or aged out, you take away with you a summary of who you are academically and functionally and what you need to do next or what you might need to do next. That's it. We're done with this week's lecture. You have an assignment, a topical activity number 2 to do for this week that includes some work in the book, in the textbook. Ask you to look at a case study there. So I'll see you next week. You've got readings for next week to take a look at. We'll be talking about bias in assessment, a very important topic. And that's it.